You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Okay, so Glenn, this trial is very quickly winding down. Both the prosecutors and the defense have rested their case. I want to talk about what's going to happen in the event of a conviction and also the likelihood of a conviction. But first, for those watching right now, if you want to follow along with our daily comprehensive coverage of this trial, please make sure to subscribe. Okay, so Glenn, this is something that struck me before. Do you think that Judge Merchan's comments when he was litigating the issue of Trump violating his gag order, and he came out and said, you may very well be the next president of the United States, you were the former president of the United States, I don't want to detain you for contempt, does that portend the possibility of no jail time, for example, if Donald Trump was to be convicted by this jury?
You know, Brian, it's a great question because we all heard Judge Merchan, after finding Donald Trump in criminal contempt 10 times over and recognizing that he could have imposed 30 days per count of criminal contempt. Donald Trump could have been locked up for 300 days for the crimes he committed. Judge Merchan added, and I was really disappointed to hear him say this, he said, you know, you're a former president, you could be the next president, and I really don't want to confine you. That was a bit of a dagger through this old prosecutor's heart because it's a judge kind of announcing that I'm going to treat you differently than I would treat any other human being who committed 10 counts of criminal contempt of court, and I'm not going to confine you. That was a low point in what I think has been a uniformly outstanding job that Judge Merchan has done presiding over this most challenging case. So what does that portend? You know, you and I have talked about this, you know, including offline. I think it sends the signal that Donald Trump was worthy of being confined even before the jury finds him guilty, in the event the jury finds him guilty. And Judge Merchan was reluctant to confine him as punishment for his crimes. And it almost sounded like Judge Merchan was a little bit apologetic about his decision. So I think that militates in favor. This is me projecting and engaging in some informed speculation as a former career prosecutor. I think that sends the signal that Judge Merchan knows Donald Trump's behavior, his conduct, and in the event of conviction, his crimes are worthy of incarceration as punishment. So I think it tends to tip the scale a little bit more in favor of a sentence to incarceration in the event of conviction, not just home detention or probation. I mean, I've always maintained that sentencing somebody who's been convicted criminally by a jury of their peers to home detention, home confinement, really is sentencing somebody to binge watch Netflix and order DoorDash. That's no
especially when you live at a place like Mar-a-Lago, which isn't exactly, it's not like you're stuck in your 450 square foot apartment.
That's no kind of punishment at all. And we would have to ask ourselves, does that really deter the, ruling class criminals, the millionaires and the billionaires? Does that really deter them in their determination to commit crime, particularly crime at the expense of the American people and the integrity of our voting systems, our free and fair elections? I think the answer is absolutely not. It does not deter the ruling class criminals, especially a guy like Trump, who grifts from his base to pay his legal fees. He doesn't even seem to be out of pocket. So there would be no punishment at all. And no punishment equals no deterrent value of this entire process. So if I had to bet, everybody knows $1 is my betting limit, not a high roller, I would put probably, I'm going to go out on a limb here, 75 cents on Donald Trump seeing the inside of a jail cell in the event of conviction on these 34 felony counts of falsifying business records.
Let's take Donald Trump out of the equation for a moment. If it was a normal defendant, if it wasn't somebody who was a former president of the United States, what kind of a punishment do you think we would see based on these charges for a person like that?
Well, let's back up, because if it were a normal human being and not Donald Trump, he would have been detained pending trial.
Right.
Because for whatever reason, the institutions of government, prosecutors and courts, have decided to sacrifice the safety of everybody else who's involved in the endeavor of holding Trump accountable for his crimes. That's witnesses, jurors, judges, prosecutors, and their respective family members. Sacrifice their safety to Donald Trump being allowed to remain free pending trial and continue to endanger all of his perceived enemies. That is a significant failure of our institutions of government. So 1, he would have been detained pending trial. 2, he would have been doing 300 days for 10 counts of criminal contempt of court that the judge concluded beyond a reasonable doubt he committed. And certainly, upon being convicted of 34 counts of felony falsifying business records, which carries a maximum prison term of 4 years per count, if anybody else but for Donald Trump engaged in this course of conduct, they would literally spend the rest of their lives in prison. What will happen to Donald Trump remains anybody's guess.
Glenn, we can't ignore the fact, though, that all of the external factors, all of these Trump fans and the threats and everything that's happening on the outside is and can have an impact on these prosecutors, on these judges, on their families, obviously. What kind of an effect is that going to have in terms of sentencing? Do you think that Judge Merchan is going to take that into account? I mean, he's already seen his daughter targeted relentlessly on right-wing media, targeted by these Republicans. So you have to assume that that's at least going to play into this a little bit, just on a human level.
Yeah, it's hard for judges who are human to completely divorce from the calculation what has been going on surrounding this unprecedented trial of a criminal former president of the United States. But I will say, Brian, I have such confidence, as bolstered by the way he handled the Robert Costello debacle, when Costello was literally being, and I quote the judge, contemptuous. He still approached that with a very level head and did, I think, the right thing under difficult circumstances when a defense witness was being contemptuous on the witness stand. I have such confidence in him that I do believe he will try to divorce all of the shenanigans that Trump and company have engaged in, all of the threats, and he will impose the sentence he believes is warranted based on the offenses of conviction. And if that is his guide, I have to believe he will sentence Donald Trump to a period of incarceration, because to not do so would be to encourage everybody else who is of Donald Trump's ilk to basically completely thumb their nose at the rule of law. That's a recipe for disaster, and I think Judge Merchan will want to avoid that.
Can you talk about the other option here if he's not incarcerated? I know that the option of probation is on the table as well. Can you talk about what that would look like?
Yeah, probation or home detention, home confinement,
yeah.
which is not an unusual sentence in white-collar cases. So what does probation look like? A judge has wide latitude to set conditions of probation. So in the ordinary case, let me kind of talk about the more generic criminal case. Judges can order somebody to wear an ankle monitor, or they can order somebody to report to a probation officer periodically, once a week, once a month. If there are issues associated with the offenses the defendant was convicted of, issues like drug use or abuse, mental health challenges, educational deficits, homelessness, poverty, lack of education, judges can order people on probation to, attend drug counseling, submit to random drug testing, get their GED if they don't have it. I'm using, obviously, the generic criminal defendant here.
Right.
The judge would have wide berth in setting conditions of probation that Donald Trump would have to satisfy. It could be travel restrictions, though I think that would be unlikely, given that Donald Trump is a presidential candidate.
I feel like if he goes the step of just allowing him probation, then he's just going to go all the way and say, like, you're probably getting probation because you're a presidential candidate, and so I'll also give you the wider berth of allowing you to travel that comes along with it.
Yeah, I think probation is a recipe for disaster for our democracy, and I think it would be sending the exact wrong signal, which is that you can commit crimes designed to interfere in American elections with absolute, ultimate impunity, right?
Yeah.
You will not be punished for it at all, even if you're convicted 34 times over by a jury of your peers, because this is an election interference case. That's why he paid the hush money, and that's why he falsified business records to get around campaign finance laws. So I think that Judge Merchan, as is true of almost all judges, with perhaps the exception of the Aileen Cannons or the Justices Thomases and Alitos of the world, I think all judges tend to understand that if there is not a punishment associated with criminal convictions, particularly ones this grave, then what you're really doing is undermining the respect for the rule of law that is really the one thing that tends to keep our democracy up and running.
Okay, so we've spoken about the merits of conviction. Let's talk about the logistics. Right now, both the prosecution and the defense have rested their case. We're off until Tuesday. So explain a little bit of what we can expect to happen in the coming days.
So, once closing arguments are complete, so the prosecutors get the first closing argument, the defense then follows with their closing argument, and then the prosecutors get a rebuttal argument because the prosecution always has the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So they get the first word and the last word, and then the jury will have it in their hands. They could deliberate a day, a week, a month. It will be up to them, how long they feel they need to pour through the evidence before reaching verdicts in the case. And, then once we have the verdict entered in the event of conviction, we'll have sentencing. And then I know people are forever asking questions about, well, he's got Secret Service protection. What does that mean? It's actually not that hard to protect somebody in an institutional setting. I had protected witnesses who testified in some of my RICO trials, and, we had to house them safely and securely because they were confined pending their testimony. And there are institutions all around the country that are actually WITSEC institutions where you can safely detain somebody.
Yeah.
And I have to believe that they could use one of those facilities. They could virtually empty it out, and Donald Trump would be the sole prisoner serving his sentence in that facility. Secret Service, if they couldn't enter into a memorandum of understanding with the Bureau of Prisons and the U.S. Marshals Service, which each of those agencies have certain responsibilities to protect inmates depending on the nature of the inmate. The Secret Service officers could take shifts and literally be posted outside of Trump's jail cell. It is actually fairly easy, and it would be fairly easy to safely to protect Donald Trump while he was serving a sentence of incarceration.
Okay, so basically we can expect the jury to begin deliberating roughly Wednesday or so after the closing arguments are complete. Let's say, in this scenario, we're assuming that they're going to hand down a conviction, or we're discussing this scenario under the assumption that they'll hand down a conviction. At that point, it will go to Judge Merchan to ultimately hand down a sentence. Is it his choice and his alone as to what the sentence is going to be?
It is his choice. And, something to keep an eye out for, though there's no way I expect it to happen. The ordinary course of business in the criminal justice system is once a jury announces guilty and there is the very real prospect of a sentence of incarceration, not just probation or a fine, more often than not, the judge will order that the defendant be taken into custody. And you've all seen this, right, on true crime programs.
Yeah.
When the jury says, we find the defendant guilty, the judge will say, marshals or bailiff or security staff, please take the defendant into custody. That's the way the system was designed to work. Now, particularly with white-collar criminals, it doesn't always work that way, and I have railed against that in my time as a prosecutor because why is it that somebody who, steals a purse or sells a rock of crack should be taken into custody immediately, but somebody who perhaps bilks large swaths of the American population out of millions and millions of dollars should be allowed to go home and get their affairs in order?
Right.
That has always, not sat well with me. So I don't expect Donald Trump to be taken into custody immediately, though I do think in the event of conviction on 34 felony counts, he should be, but he probably won't be.
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on all of this as it continues to play out. For those watching right now, if you want to stay on top of this, Glenn and I will continue our daily comprehensive coverage of this trial until its conclusion. So please, if you're not yet subscribed, make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.